Clouds floated slowly across the azure sky, and our heroine wondered where it all went wrong. If you were stranded on a desert island, what would you do first? The students raised their hands and answered that they needed to determine their location and make a fire. And we also needed to stock up on food and water, to which the counselor replied that all of these options were correct. To return, you need to find out where you are, get food and water, and adapt to local conditions. The counselor finished her speech and dramatically raised her finger upward, emphasizing the importance of her last words. She said the most important thing is to never lose hope. After all, despair clouds the mind and begins to devour you from within. The students listened to the counselor's instructions with fascination, admiring her every word. The counselor suggested starting the lesson and blew her whistle, but suddenly something changed. Before her eyes appeared the image of a blonde beauty in a fluffy dress and with a fan in her hand. Suddenly, the same girl changed her facial expression and screamed in fear, pressing her hands to her chest. She slowly rose from the sand and knelt down, trying to collect her thoughts. Raising her head up, she screamed in despair, as if asking the sky where she was. But the sky, and the entire island on which she found herself, did not answer her question. The girl recalled that it all started when she found a draft of a novel on the street. The book was called More Important Than Survival, and while she was reading it, her life was unexpectedly cut short. The novel begins with a story about the main character, a great saint and 5 guys, and they all suddenly wake up on a desert island, somewhere very far from home. The author vividly described how they survived for a year on the enchanted island, as if it were a real survival novel. But in reality, it was a hardcore, perverted romance with an age restriction. The girl grabbed her head and took a deep breath, trying to calm down a little. Gathering her courage, she whispered that she had possessed not the main character, but the villain Margaret. The girl looked at her reflection, from which a completely different person was looking back at her, Margaret Rose Floan. A beautiful blonde with cold blue eyes, she is the second daughter of the ducal house of Floan in the Langrid Empire. In the novel, she envies the main character, who has captured the love of all the heroes and even tries to kill her. Ultimately, playing the role of a villain throughout the novel, she is killed by the maddened heroes in the middle. Suddenly, Margaret closed her eyes in sharp pain and, clutching her head, exhaled heavily. Margaret's life and her own memories were mixed together, giving her a headache. She began to wonder what if this really was that novel, and if she really had possessed the villain. The first thing she needed to do was find a safe place to hide, and the girl began to look around. She has to survive here for a year until the door leading off the island opens. The girl also firmly decided that she should not encounter Crown Prince Enoch. All the heroes hated Margaret, but there was one who despised her more than anyone. It was the main character of the novel and the crown prince of the Langrid Empire, Enoch Astor Klaus Langrid. The girl remembered his image from the book, with a cold, contemptuous look. Suddenly, that same prince appeared before her eyes, lying on the sand. Margaret clutched her head, because the difficulty of her survival had now skyrocketed. Then it dawned on the girl that since Enoch was here, it meant she had found herself at the very beginning of the novel. She began to remember the beginning of the novel. Enoch opened his eyes on the sandy shore. Suddenly, the prince frowned and groaned quietly, and the girl jerked as if from an electric shock. As if waking up from a spell, she realized that now was not the time to stand there like a pillar. She needed to come up with a plan as quickly as possible about where exactly she could escape to before the prince woke up. The sea was blocked and running there was useless, so we had to run into the forest and try to hide there. But Margaret was suddenly grabbed by the leg, and before she could come to her senses, she fell face down into the sand. The prince languidly whispered the girl's name, and his hands moved from her ankle to her arms. Soon the guy grabbed her face and pulled her closer to him, causing her to chuckle softly. Pulling Margaret closer to him, the guy asked where she was going to run. The girl couldn't believe that she hadn't managed to escape, and tears of irritation appeared in her eyes. Realizing that life is made up of bad coincidences, the girl screamed at the top of her lungs, "Save me!" Enoch grabbed the heroine who was trying to escape from him and addressed her by name. Cupping her cheeks with his fingers, he asked the Duchess what was going on. She assumed that Enoch was thinking about his abduction and regretted that she had not run away immediately, but informed him that she herself knew nothing. Margaret raised her finger in an attempt to confuse Enoch, who was distracted by this provocation. The girl, taking advantage of the moment, broke free from his hands and fell flat on the sand. Enoch did not like Margaret's behavior, and he grabbed her roughly by the dress and looked angrily into her eyes. He was furious and ordered the girl to stop joking and explain what was happening. Margaret, lying on the sand, was puzzled by the question and continued to explain to the prince that she herself was in shock and did not know anything. Enoch bowed before the princess's face, gritting his teeth, and said that he would never believe her words. Margaret, having analyzed her actions, accepted that his paranoia was in fact very fair. The girl remembered that in the past Margaret was a famous stalker of Prince Enoch. She once bought a love elixir, which turned out to be a substance that caused a severe allergy and almost killed the prince. She could have been sentenced for this crime, but the strong influence of the duchy did not allow this. It also played a big role that the prince was the son of a servant and did not have such support. Margaret continued to explain to the prince that this was a misunderstanding and no one was going to kidnap him. She suggested that if anyone could have organized the kidnapping, it was the deposed heir Rodban, exiled to the north. Margaret, having put these facts together, suggested that perhaps Enoch was right about the political motives. Pulling her hand back, she informed the prince that now it was necessary to survive and then decide all the other issues. Margaret, having informed the prince that she had finished, began to leave, but he again caught her hand and stopped her. The girl asked the guy to let her go, but he refused and did not allow her to escape again. Margaret suggested climbing the mountain and exploring the area to figure out where they were. The girl remembered that while reading the book, the magic of the island was described, and at night it was actively swarming with animals. All active actions must be completed during the day before dangerous darkness sets in. Margaret suggested that the night on the climb might end badly and suggested climbing tomorrow. The prince, hearing this, said that he did not expect such sound thoughts from such a lady, which offended Margaret. Enoch agreed with the girl and decided to look around and find shelter and climb the mountain tomorrow. The prince, who had achieved the throne on his own, was very quick to assess the situation on the island, but this did not stop him from going mad with obsession. Margaret had a sudden inspiration and tried to remember if there were any modern survival items in the book. The novel was unusual because it had some modern survival items hidden inside. The characters, unfortunately, had no idea how to use them and simply got rid of them. Margaret, unlike them, understood perfectly how they worked and decided to find the hut where the heroes lived. The prince looked angrily at the Duchess and ordered her not to even think about running away. Margaret appreciated the prince's intelligence and decided that it would be best to play along and agree. The girl admitted that being with one man who despises her is better than being with 5 of them. The prince swung the branch powerfully, cutting a tree leaf, which greatly frightened Margaret, who saw it. He looked closely at the stick, grinned, and said that it would do for the first time. Margaret began to hesitate a little. The prince, noticing this, made her hurry as quickly as possible. Looking at the sun, the girl determined that it had already begun to slowly set. The edge of the cliffs ran into rocks, and our heroes had to go as deep into the forest as possible. Margaret warned His Highness that they needed to get out of the forest before dark. She suggested that they return to the place where they met as soon as possible. The heroes heard something terrible growl menacingly at them from the depths of the forest. It was the angry howl of a wolf, which began to appear slowly, coming into the light towards our heroes. Margaret did not understand why the beast attacked them, as she thought that they only attack at night. The beast bared its teeth and continued to growl angrily, preparing to attack our heroes. The wolf was already very close, and Margaret could not hold back a cry of fear. Suddenly, the prince's strong arms embraced her and pressed her to him, and he held out his stick, driving away the wolf. Enoch froze for a moment, looking at the beast's grinning mouth, his stick tightly clutched in his hand. But the next moment, the improvised weapon plunged into the wolf's neck. The beast fell to the ground, bleeding, and soon stopped showing signs of life. Margaret was shocked that such a beast could be killed with one blow from an ordinary branch. Looking at the prince up close, the girl thought that it was because he was the main character here. Meeting the prince's gaze, she remembered that he seemed to have some kind of injury related to blood. But she didn't have time to finish her thought, because the prince stopped holding her, and the girl fell. She thought angrily that she had worried about him in vain, because she had enough problems herself. The girl wondered why the beast attacked, since the sun had not set yet. After all, the original book said that animals attack only at night. Imagining the forest at night, she began to think that maybe it wasn't the night, but the darkness. Monsters can move when it is dark, and at night, when the darkness lasts longer, they are most active. Margaret clutched the hem of her dress tightly, wondering how she could avoid dying before they found the hut. The girl was clearly frightened, and this state of hers did not escape the prince's attention. He thought that this situation frightened her, because for the noble lady this was the first time. Enoch leaned over to the girl and asked if she was okay, adding that he had no idea what it was. The prince touched her cheek and Margaret was confused, not expecting such an attitude towards herself. He added that he was interested because she looked as if she was going to die right then and there. The girl was surprised that he was behaving differently than when he pushed her away. Coming to her senses, she replied that she was fine and thanked the prince for saving her. He reminded them that the girl was still under suspicion and that when they returned to the Empire, he would sort out the situation. Straightening up, he added that he forbade her to die without permission. The girl didn't understand what she had done, and the prince urged her to get up faster. Taking the boy's hand, she thought that such childish assertiveness made her feel calmer. The day passed and the sun was setting, painting the sky and sea in scarlet colors. Margaret sighed heavily, as if after hard physical work, and wiped the sweat from her forehead. She made a canopy. Enoch brought stones, leaves, and sticks for it, and she was busy assembling their dwelling. When the prince let her go ahead, the girl appreciated his manners even towards someone he didn't like. Once inside, the prince asked not to cuddle, as he did not like sleeping so close. The girl replied that she wasn't happy either, because she didn't know what he might do, and this tone angered the guy. Margaret immediately corrected herself, calling his title Your Majesty, and smiled peacefully. The girl felt very awkward and cramped being so close to the guy. She suddenly asked if the prince wanted to run away, and he assumed that this was her next attempt to escape. But Margaret said she hadn't had a sip of water since they arrived on the island and was at risk of dehydration. The prince listened silently to the girl's complaints, but soon he could not bear it and turned to her. The innocent eyes of a young girl looked at him. She said that she would quickly return with a couple of coconuts. The man's heart couldn't take it anymore, and he simply asked what this coconut looked like. After a while, she returned with a couple of coconuts and proudly showed them to the prince. She explained that this fruit grows on a palm tree, and its juice is excellent for replenishing fluids. After checking that the coconut was not overripe, the girl tried to split it, explaining that an overripe fruit could cause indigestion. Looking at the girl's efforts, the guy snorted and split the coconut into 2 parts with his bare hands. He handed Margaret half a coconut without spilling a drop of the juice inside. Amazed by the incredible strength, she thanked His Highness for his concern. The girl checked the juice and told the prince that everything was fine and that he could now drink it. As the prince watched the girl drink the juice, he thought about her behavior that he had observed today, and he came to the conclusion that this girl was the complete opposite of the Margaret he knew before. He couldn't understand how his daughter, obsessed with aristocracy, could know how to build a stove bench or that there was juice in Coke. Looking at the girl, he wondered if she was really the person he knew. Feeling his gaze, the girl looked at the prince and asked in surprise if something had happened. But Enoch could not answer anything, and only looked at the girl with surprise and thought. And I wondered if this lady could have been a completely different person. After thinking for a while, the prince said that it seemed the lady had really become a different person. The girl was confused by these words and froze, wondering what to answer the prince. After thinking, she replied that in extreme conditions, everyone changes in their own way. Since Enoch already suspected something was wrong, Margaret decided to deny everything. After all, if she says that she is not that lady, the prince might perceive it as a game. The guy looked at the girl with disbelief and replied that this happens extremely rarely. Margaret began to feel nervous about his words and quickly tried to think of what to say. But the prince got ahead of her and stood up and said that, judging by her actions, perhaps she was right. He added that an ordinary lady would not have been able to keep her cool in such a situation. The girl sighed with relief and suggested returning to their temporary shelter. Night had already fallen on the island, and Margaret thought that the first danger had passed. But the girl couldn't fall asleep, as she was constantly distracted by extraneous noises. But what distracted her most was Enoch's breathing, and she couldn't figure out how she could sleep in such an environment. They lay with their backs pressed against each other, and this situation greatly embarrassed Margaret. But it turned out that the prince also could not sleep and said that the creature was not an animal. He added that it emitted energy very similar to a monster. Raising his hand, he said that the sword aura, the energy emanating from the sharp blade of the sword, had not appeared either. Margaret thought that this world really does have its own rules. But magic and divine power don't work on this island, which means you'll have to survive on your own. And if you remember the prince's inhuman strength, then perhaps there is no need to worry about it. The girl's thoughts were interrupted by the prince's words that he should not tell the lady something she did not understand. And he added that the most suspicious thing here is that it was he and the lady who ended up on the island. The girl replied that if she had planned to kidnap him, she would have chosen a more comfortable place, and not this wild area. But meeting the prince's distrustful gaze, she added that of course she had no such intention. And deciding to change the subject, she asked what His Majesty had done before arriving on the island. The prince replied that he had a lot of paperwork accumulated and had been working for the past few days. The guy added that these questions were like an interrogation, and the girl agreed that this was him. After thinking for a moment, Enoch replied that he had been busy summing up the year for the past few months and had not left the castle. In response, he asked Margaret what she had been doing lately. The girl smiled mysteriously, wondering how to answer the prince without arousing suspicion. Needless to say, in recent months, she was the only one in the mansion who had been obsessed with the prince's portrait. And she smiled at her own thoughts, realizing that she would never be able to say such a thing. She said out loud that she had recently been in the salon of the mansion, drinking tea, meeting guests, but she did not remember anyone suspicious. The prince said it was too early to jump to conclusions, and Margaret suggested ending the interrogation. Plopping down on the ground, she suggested that today we gather our strength and rest. And she added that tomorrow we need to climb the mountain to understand where they are. Seeing how the lady, flushed from the heat, closed her eyes, the prince felt a little embarrassed. But he immediately added that if she crossed the line, he would throw her into the sea, to which the girl replied that she would not come even if he called. Now on that island are the Prince of Hestia, the Captain of the Guard, the Great Saint, the High Priest, and the Great Mage. Since all the important people were gathered, it does not look like this is an attempt on Enoch's life alone. According to her recollections, in the novel the characters wake up in different places. Enoch quarreled with Margaret on the shore and then met the heroine Juana. The girl tensed up because her appearance had caused the plot to go wrong from the very beginning. But the biggest problem was that she didn't finish the novel. After all, if the plot changes, then the hut will certainly not be safe either. She decided that when she found the hut, she would collect all the necessary things and go to the bunker. Towards the end of the first volume, the heroine Juana found not only a hut, but also an underground bunker. However, the heroes never used it, but went back through the door. She still hoped that this was all a long dream, and that when she woke up she would find herself at home, in her own bed, and if that was the case, then she regretted only one thing, that she would not meet her beloved hero, the Archmage Kaiden. Meanwhile, somewhere far away in the mountains, a pack of wolves was running to hunt, howling as they went. Margaret was right. They were not alone on the island. At the same time, someone was wandering among the trees. The blonde looked around with a predatory grin, trying to figure out where he was. When morning came, Margaret realized with regret that it was not a dream, and she was still on the island. As she got up, she thought that it was very cold at night, and next time she would definitely have to make a fire. Suddenly, the girl noticed something slip as she stood up. She picked it up in surprise and realized it was Enoch's jacket. Realizing that the prince had already woken up, Margaret turned around and called him. The prince looked as usual, but something was wrong, and the girl guessed that he had not slept all night. The guy looked gloomy, and she asked if he really hadn't slept all night. The girl immediately began to scold him for wasting his energy, especially since they still had to climb the mountain today. The prince explained that he had not slept because he had not decided whether he could trust Margaret, but despite such harsh words, he covered the girl with his jacket at night. Margaret smiled, thinking that this was the first time she had seen a man whose words and actions were so at odds with each other. Suddenly, the girl's stomach began to rumble very loudly, and she covered it with her hands in embarrassment. She shyly suggested that they eat some coconuts and then go up the mountain, and the prince agreed with her. When they climbed the mountain, the sun was already high and the sea sparkled in the distance. It seemed as if the reality of the whole situation was only just beginning to dawn on Margaret. Only when she looked at the endless sea did she realize that she was abandoned on this damned island. The prince slammed the ground hard as the gravity of the situation dawned on him. He was upset that they had ended up on this particular island. The prince said he had no idea where they were, and it was also unclear who had sent them there. Looking at Enoch, the girl thought that this was the first time she had seen him in such despair. But she also understood that her situation was even darker than the prince's. The door will open only in a year. Will she be able to survive among the heroes going crazy? She decided that she needed to escape as quickly as possible before Enoch went crazy. Margaret watched the prince as he sat on the ground, clutching his head in despair. And the guy thought that the situation was getting worse and everything around looked very dangerous. The girl thought that as a former scout, she could not abandon him and decided to postpone the escape and first take action. Margaret extended her hand to the prince and said that they needed to go down, as they realized that they were on an island. She was confident and with a serious face suggested that the prince survive at any cost. Looking at the confused young man, the girl understood that although he was Prince Enoch, he had been through many battles. He hasn't slept and has expended a lot of energy getting up. It will be difficult for him to make a sound decision. And looking at the prince's displeased face, she realized that he was unlikely to accept a helping hand from Margaret. The girl started to say that the monsters might come back, but suddenly the guy took her hand, accepting help. She was momentarily at a loss as she watched the prince slowly rise and seem to calm down. Rising, Enoch smiled warmly at the girl and thanked her for her help. Suddenly, this touching scene was interrupted by a rumbling in the girl's stomach. She immediately began to speak loudly to drown out the sound, and the prince said that he had not heard anything. But the rumbling was so loud that it could not be drowned out, and the girl said that they had spent a lot of energy climbing the mountain. When they went downstairs, the prince suddenly asked anxiously what she meant by the word, "Let's have a snack." He didn't believe that the noble lady was going to fish, but Margaret asked him to just believe her. The girl leaned over and said that even if the fishing didn't work out, she would collect some shellfish and seaweed. As she prepared to go fishing, she lifted the hem of her skirt, exposing her legs, causing the prince's face to turn red. Rising, she asked the prince to light a fire, but he quickly turned away. Looking at the prince's back, she thought that maybe he was seeing a girl's bare legs for the first time. Margaret asked if he knew how to make a fire, and the prince said that he had once fallen behind his army and was surviving alone. Raising her stick, she said that she had then asked him to make a fire while she was away. Margaret was tense and tried to remember everything about the local wildlife. It seems that except for wolves and reptiles, all other animals were ordinary animals. And since coconuts alone won't keep you full, you need to start getting food. Armed, she decided that to obtain nutrients, she needed to hunt live game. As she approached the sea, her confidence diminished slightly, as sea fishing was a new experience for the girl. She decided that first she needed to find a place where the water stagnated and did not drain away. First, you need to examine the crevices in the rocks where the waves crash, where small fish are squeezed between the stones. Small fish caught in this way need to be crushed with stones and scattered in the water as bait. After these manipulations, Margaret gripped the spear tightly and prepared to hunt. Having waited for the right moment, the girl mentally decided that the time had come and forcefully lowered the spear into the sea. The stick with the sharpened stone fell into the sea with a whistle, splashing water around it. Margaret smiled contentedly, saying out loud that she had indeed succeeded. Looking at the caught fish, the girl said with delight that she was a genius because she managed to catch the fish for the first time. And with longing, I remembered that when I was involved in hardcore camping, I realized even then that the wild nature is my element. Of course, she didn't imagine herself as some crazy master from TV shows, but the feeling of satisfaction was simply unreal. Suddenly, she heard some noise behind her and, turning around, met the gaze of the confused prince. Margaret stood there, embarrassed, wondering how long he had been standing there and what he had been able to hear of her speech. And then she decided not to lose face and caught another fish under Enoch's watchful gaze. Sitting by the fire, the prince said it was impressive and added that he didn't know the lady could fillet fish. Margaret thought that anyone who enjoyed fishing could do it, even with a knife made of wood. Suddenly, she remembered the development of the plot in the book, and it struck her like lightning. In the original, the heroine only accepted the spoils that Enoch brought, including fish. And now our heroine, like a seasoned survivalist, catches and brings fish to the prince. This thought made the girl feel uneasy, and she skewered the fish with a frowning face. She understood that she had volunteered for this role, but she felt somehow strange. The prince noticed her gaze and asked what was wrong, but Margaret turned away and said that everything was fine. Suddenly, Enoch moved almost close to the girl and, leaning towards her face, asked if everything was really okay. He seemed genuinely concerned about Margaret's sudden change in mood, which made her feel embarrassed. But the next moment he put his hand on her head and smiled cheerfully. The prince said it was interesting to watch, but next time he would get the food himself. Taking the sticks with fish, he walked up to the fire and placed them next to the fire. The girl covered her burning cheeks with her hand and mentally cursed that she had almost given in. He brought his handsome face so close to her so suddenly that the girl's heart almost jumped out. She ordered herself to pull herself together, otherwise she would completely fall under Enoch's spell. The two young men sat by the fire in complete silence, waiting for the fish to be ready. Having removed the browned catch, Margaret handed one fish to the prince, inviting him to take a larger piece. But the guy didn't reach for the offered fish and looked at it strangely. Suddenly he reached for the smaller fish and said that they were not in the Langrid Empire. He added that no pleasantries were needed first and foremost. She should take care of herself. The prince said that he understood the girl's anxiety in finding herself in an unfamiliar place, but he would definitely help her. Margaret didn't answer, but looked thoughtfully from the prince to the fire. Enoch asked if the girl really thought he would let her go so easily. And looking into the eyes of the surprised Margaret, he repeated that she should be next to him. Having risen, he added that she would be able to leave his company only when he himself let her go. The girl said that she understood everything, but to herself, she thought that this was similar to the line of the main character, who was in love with the heroine, but it was only a threat. And when she turned away from the fire, the prince's jacket suddenly fell on her shoulders. Seeing him go away somewhere, the girl asked in surprise why he did that. Entering their shelter, the guy replied that he was just hot and added that there was no need to thank him. Margaret felt a little upset by these dismissive words and thought that she had known it. But she still smiled, wrapping herself in her jacket, because today she would sleep in the warmth. In the middle of the night, the prince was awakened by our heroine's groaning, and he sat up, looking at her with displeasure. Looking at her, the guy thought that maybe she was cold because she was lying without covering herself with a jacket. He decided to cover the girl, muttering under his breath that there was no point in giving her the jacket. Suddenly he froze, hearing the girl's dissatisfied muttering, "Lousy creature." She cowered in the cold and spoke in her sleep, "You filthy creature, you heartless bastard." Margaret reached for the jacket that kept her warm when she was cold. She whispered that it seemed like the jacket didn't love her anymore because it was lying on another useless body. Enoch was confused when he heard the girl muttering about how cold she was, and without thinking much, he covered her with a jacket, after which the girl began to snore sweetly. Soon morning came. The sea sparkled and shimmered, reflecting the sun's rays. Margaret woke up and stretched, complaining that her whole body was numb because she had been sleeping in the middle of nowhere for the second night already. Suddenly, a prince appeared nearby and loudly said in the girl's ear that it seemed that love had been saved. Margaret turned around sharply and asked in fear what he meant. The prince asked if she didn't remember muttering something about a filthy creature at night. And also, a heartless bastard. How could she fall out of love so quickly? Why is she lying on this useless body? And with a malicious grin, he said that the girl was hugging the jacket, crying and cursing. Margaret tried to save face and replied that in fact, she was an aristocrat and did not swear, and she suggested that perhaps His Highness had dreamed all of this. The guy just smiled and said that since she was so embarrassed, he would pretend he hadn't heard anything. And rising, he added that Lady Floan had always been a tough nut to crack. The prince was clearly amused by the situation, so he added that he was not at all surprised by such behavior. Margaret thought to herself that it would have been better if he had said that she was strange. But suddenly Enoch said that he supported her love, which confused the girl. Here she lost her composure and cried out in embarrassment that everything was wrong with everyone. The clear morning sky gradually began to become covered with clouds, foreshadowing imminent rain for our heroes. Margaret handed the prince the folded jacket and thanked him. For a moment he hesitated to take the jacket and looked at it as if deciding something. But he still took it and said that for a man this is self-evident. And he added that if there was anything else he could help with, he would be happy to help. The girl said thoughtfully that she was thinking about how they could survive as long as possible, and to do this, they need to go as deep into the forest as possible and not stay on the shore. Enoch asked if she wasn't going to wait for help since she had decided to go into the forest. He agreed that the chances of survival would increase further inland, but rescue might not come. Of course, Margaret understood that there was sense in the prince's words, but, unlike Enoch, she knew that the only way off this island was through the door. But if she tells about it, he will suspect the girl of the crime even more. After some thought, Margaret decided that there was nothing she could do, and she had to insist on her own way. The prince froze in surprise, watching the girl, and could not understand what she had in mind this time. Our heroine gathered her things and began to thank the prince for saving her, adding that she truly felt calmer with him. And having bowed to the prince, the girl prepared to go into the depths of the forest, holding the caught fish tightly on a rope. Having overcome his surprise, the guy rushed towards her and, grabbing her by the shoulder, turned her towards him. He recalled yesterday's words about her leaving only when she was released, but the girl objected that their opinions did not coincide, and she concluded her impassioned speech by saying that she had made a rational choice. The prince clearly did not expect such pressure from the aristocratic lady and listened to her in confusion. She thought that the animals were a threat, but it was more important not to miss the moment when the door opened, which meant she needed to find a hut or a bunker. But the most important thing was to unravel the mystery of this island, because only then could she understand why she had entered Margaret's body. But the prince did not agree and said that she was calling some kind of madness a rational act. Suddenly the girl looked straight into the prince's eyes and asked if he was worried about her. The guy was embarrassed, and she asked if he was afraid that something would happen to her. If not, then maybe he just wants to keep the suspicious Margaret close. She said with a smile that she was more resilient than she looked, because he had seen how she had coped before. She asked the prince not to worry about her, but he suddenly interrupted her and said that they would go together. The prince said that he would be with her, but would still look for a way to signal for help. The prince was determined and wanted to find a way out of this island. The girl began to think that perhaps the hatred towards Margaret had begun to fade due to the time they had spent together. She agreed with a smile and thought that if she earned Enoch's trust, her destiny could change. The girl froze, staring at the floor, and an interesting idea came to her mind. She called out loudly to the prince and with her index finger ordered him to look in that direction. Pointing to a nearby rock, Margaret suggested that there were usually caves underneath it. Proudly walking past the prince, the Duchess announced that she had received a well-rounded education. Enoch, looking at her, noticed that the Duke subjected his daughter to very harsh training. Having learned about this, the prince thought about it and realized that he had been underestimating his companion all this time. Margaret didn't really understand what the prince was so angry about, but she was glad that he was now helping her. She told the prince about the approaching rain and asked him to hurry to the rock. Margaret hurried to avoid being caught by the rain, but her dress caught on a branch. This incident greatly frightened the Duchess, and she fell into a slight stupor. She hurried to take shelter from the rain and, unfortunately, tripped over her own foot. A moment later, Margaret was lying face down on the ground, cursing her enormous dress. Enoch was very afraid for his companion and immediately ran to check if everything was okay with her. He offered his hand to the Duchess and asked if she could stand on her feet. Margaret rose to her feet and buried her head in Prince Enoch's chest, trying to compose herself. Enoch turned away so as not to embarrass his companion and silently looked away. He sat the Duchess down on a branch and began examining her legs for bruises. Enoch put the leg in his hand and began to examine it carefully. Margaret watched what was happening and felt very ticklish from his touch. The prince, seeing the bruises and abrasions, understood why his companion constantly lagged behind him. Enoch sat up, looking at the surprised Duchess, and apologized in advance for what was happening. A moment later, he picked up his companion in his arms and hugged her tightly to himself so as not to drop her. Margaret was shocked by what was happening and blushed deeply with embarrassment. She tried to break free, but the prince insisted, assuring her that this way they would get to the rock faster. The prince warned them that they were leaving and asked the Duchess to hold on as tightly as possible. Margaret still couldn't believe what was happening, but she held on tight so as not to fall. She continued to feel embarrassed because she was very close to Prince Enoch. Clouds were gathering in the sky above the forest, becoming darker and thicker with every second. A raven sitting on a tree watched as the prince and his companion in his arms ran past him. He jumped down from the branch and screamed loudly over the forest, surprising Duchess Margaret. She felt completely safe being next to the book's main character. Margaret felt favorably treated and hoped that this did not change with the appearance of the heroine. The girl felt that over time she had changed and become a completely different person. She accepted that she had been born again and decided that she would no longer behave as before. The prince stopped suddenly, and the Duchess was worried that she had said something wrong. Margaret realized that she had rushed things and opened up too much to the prince. Enoch pulled her close and, looking into her eyes, told her that he did not feel any sympathy for her. He informed her that he was being polite to her as befits a true gentleman. Enoch asked the Duchess to come down to earth and not to entertain false hopes. He assumed that such a relationship would only complicate life for both of them. Birds were making noise in the forest, and there was some kind of unpleasant noise all around. The heroes heard the sound of footsteps coming from all sides. Margaret grabbed the prince's cloak tightly and began to scream in fear. The red wolves began to attack, baring their teeth and growling menacingly at the characters. The Duchess shouted to His Highness about the danger and pushed him away in the shoulder. Margaret, saving the prince, began to fall rapidly to the ground, surrounded by wolves. The prince did not have time to grab the Duchess and, out of desperation, called her by name. The animals, seeing their prey, began to slowly surround the girl who had fallen to the ground. Margaret held onto her dress tightly and prepared herself for the predator's attack. The red wolves, baring their teeth, moved ever closer to the trembling Duchess. The monsters were salivating in anticipation of the taste of easy prey in the person of our heroine. Margaret was already preparing herself for the wolves to rush straight at her. At the last second before the jump, the wolf received a powerful blow to the head from a log. Enoch, holding the beast by the head, ordered his companion to stop looking and save herself. The Duchess gathered her courage and set herself the task of surviving. She jumped away from the animals and promised to stop being a burden to the prince. The first thing the Duchess did was to climb a tree so that they couldn't reach her. The red wolf managed to bite the girl on the dress, which prevented her from climbing the tree. The Duchess, cursing her long dress, began to fall down straight into the mouth of the terrible beast. Enoch, seeing this, rushed to help, despite the attacks of the evil creatures. Margaret, seeing this, complained that similar situations happened to her all the time. The Duchess never understood why His Highness was always so stubborn. He always declared that he would not marry her or even become engaged, although the Duchess had something that he did not. Margaret was of pure, noble descent, unlike the prince. The girl remembered the unpleasant things Margaret had said and understood why the prince was so cold. Because of such actions, the prince will most likely never be able to truly love her. Escaping to the bunker alone seemed like the most logical decision for the Duchess. She was about to take steps to leave, but suddenly a picture came into her mind. The Duchess began to remember the time she spent with the prince on this island. I thought they had gotten a little closer to His Highness Prince Enoch. Margaret opened her eyes and slowly began to come to her senses, sitting on the ground. She sat near the tree, almost unconscious, trying to understand what was happening. She felt ill, and the surrounding scene swam before her blue eyes. Clutching her head, the Duchess thought that the red wolves had already eaten her. Looking around, she wondered where all this blood came from. The bloody bodies of red wolves lay around the Duchess. Seeing this, Margaret immediately wondered if all was well with Prince Enoch. She saw the prince standing with his back to her and hoped that he was okay. Meeting his gaze, she concluded that only Enoch could save her. The Duchess was a little confused when she saw His Highness's hands covered in blood. She remembered the consequences of the wars for Prince Enoch. At the sight of blood, Enoch fell into a madness that slowly drained his body. The prince can only be stopped when he himself falls to exhaustion. The prince began to turn his head with angry eyes and unclear intentions. Margaret didn't wait to see how this story ended, hit him on the head and knocked him out. Enoch lay unconscious at the feet of Duchess Margaret, who had knocked him out. If she hadn't knocked out the prince, she would most likely be dead by now. In the forest, the leaves began to rustle and the first drops fell. A downpour was descending. The Duchess had to put the prince on her shoulders and drag him to that very cliff. Her head was spinning and she didn't understand how she got back. His Majesty was very ill. He was unconscious, but writhed and muttered. The Duchess watched the prince suffer and was very worried about his condition. There were deep wounds on his body, and Margaret was worried that poison might have gotten into them. She tore fabric from her dress with her teeth to bandage his wounds. The situation was critical, and it was necessary to provide at least first aid. All that was left was to pray that infection wouldn't set in and things wouldn't get worse. Margaret watched the prince and, exhaling, thought that all the horror was behind her. The Duchess had no choice but to wait until the prince came to his senses. He was still in a state of insanity. If he woke up at this moment, there would be problems. Margaret saw the rope and decided to play it safe by tying up His Highness. They were under a cliff where the rain did not reach, and the Duchess was tying up the prince. The rain was a great way to get some fresh water to drink. Rainwater fell on the prince, and he, coming to his senses, opened his eyes. He tried to free himself, but was tied with rope on his hands and feet. He began to get nervous and scream, not understanding why he was lying tied up on the ground. The Duchess, seeing this, was glad that the prince had woken up and come to his senses. She was carrying a bowl of water and brushwood, and as she passed by, she asked the prince how he was feeling. The prince, kneeling, asked the Duchess what she had done to him. He looked at her with fear and demanded that she release him immediately. Seeing the convulsive syndrome, she decided that it was too early to untie it. She informed the prince that if he moved now, he would worsen his wounds. The prince did not listen to the Duchess and continued to fidget. She threatened him with her finger. She demanded in a serious tone that the prince stop and obey her, and without removing her finger, she forced His Majesty to calm down and lie still. The prince became frightened, sat down, and really began to wait for further instructions. The heroes did not expect such actions from each other and simply looked at each other. The Duchess couldn't believe that these actions actually worked. She recalled that such a reaction was not even present in the original book. The prince was in shock and did not understand why his body suddenly stopped moving. Margaret tried to calm the prince and said that everything was fine. She placed her hand on his cheek and continued to reassure His Highness. The Duchess enjoyed what was happening and looked tenderly into the prince's eyes. The prince could not bear all this and began to slowly fall on his side. Having fallen to the ground without strength, he began to fall asleep and regain his strength. The Duchess was glad that everything ended this way and that she was not torn apart like those animals. She recalled that in reality, when she read the book, there was a plot about blood and fury. She would have liked to continue, but she remembered the vulgar moment and became embarrassed. Grabbing her hair, she tried to forget what she had just remembered. In any case, their relationship became closer after that, and for her it was a game of survival. She looked at the sleeping prince and complained about how hard it was for her. Rainwater continued to drip into the coconut container for drinking. Margaret looked at the sun, which was blinding her eyes, and tried to cover herself with her hand. Looking around the forest, she concluded that the rain had finally stopped. The prince's condition improved despite the fever and a difficult night. The Duchess came to the camp and was very surprised by what she saw. His Highness lay on the ground and tossed and turned violently. He felt unwell. Margaret took out a coconut mug and offered the prince some water to drink. She untied his bound feet and gave the prince some water to drink in the hope that he would feel better. Margaret was glad he had come to, but he still needed medical attention. She decided that it would be necessary to search the area for medicinal herbs. The Duchess informed the prince that she was going in search of herbs and food. Enoch watched his companion leave, not fully understanding what she had said. Holding the bowl in his hands, he realized that the Duchess had not untied his hands. He got angry and started shouting to be untied, but it was too late. Margaret had already gone deep into the forest and was searching for what she needed. She picked up some grass and concluded that it would be good for stopping the bleeding. Continuing to collect herbs, she concluded that she needed to return before dark. Suddenly, something frightened the girl, and she heard a strange sound. She looked further into the forest, trying to figure out what sound she was hearing, and whether she was imagining it. Margaret thought it might be a monster, but it was too bright. Then she realized that there was a high probability that it was a person. She jumped up, realizing that even if it was a person, it was a problem. She remembered that there were 5 people on the island, and it would be difficult for her to keep track of them all. Margaret, seeing something unusual, could not believe her eyes. In front of her stood a man with a very interesting silver earring with a stone on his ear. The man, seeing our heroine, was pleasantly surprised to meet another person here. Margaret hoped she was imagining things, but when she heard the boy's voice, her eyes widened in surprise. She looked at him, silver hair, red eyes, an earring in his ear, and a predatory smile. The guy was glad that there was another person on the island, but the girl was shocked and couldn't understand where Kaiden Blake himself had appeared in front of her. Realizing that she was in deep trouble, the girl jumped up and ran away from the guy, who was following her in confusion. As Margaret ran away, she reflected that she had encountered a male character who must be avoided at all costs. The girl knew that in the original novel, Enoch was the one who hated Margaret the most, but the most dangerous person for her was this smiling blonde man, Kaiden. The girl remembered well the decisive moment for her heroine in the novel. After all, in the middle of the novel, Margaret died at the hands of Kaiden Blake. Once upon a time, according to the story of the novel, he was an ordinary boy from an aristocratic family, Kaiden Blake Rojade. He was the second son of the Rohad family, an ordinary boy with a slightly gloomy look. However, as a child, he was kidnapped by the temple, and some terrible experiments were carried out on him. The parents managed to find their son, and Marquis Rojad was able to make a deal with the temple, after which the matter was absurdly hushed up. However, this past became a fuse, and Kaiden hated both his family and the temple, and spent his entire life trying to thwart any plans of the temple and his family. If you look at it from this angle alone, Kaiden had no reason to hate Margaret in the original. But there was still one situation. After all, Margaret was promoting an experiment at that very time. She promoted and sponsored an experiment with a love potion in the very temple that the boy hated so much. Unfortunately, the girl didn't manage to run far, and Kaiden, having caught up with Margaret, grabbed her by the hand, trying to stop her. He pulled the girl slightly towards himself and asked her to wait, but she didn't want to stop at all. She also remembered that Kaiden had once come to the Duke of Flone's house and caused a disturbance, and the girl's legs had become tangled from these thoughts. With a scream, the girl flew to the ground, pulling Kaiden with her, who was holding her hand tightly. As she fell to the ground, the girl recalled that despite this, Margaret did not give up and continued the experiment. The two young men fell to the ground, but Kaiden managed to cover the girl, gently shielding her head from the impact with the ground. Looking at the guy's confused face, the girl thought that it was after this incident that Kaiden began to hate Margaret. Our heroine looked at the guy with fear, trying to figure out what to do in this difficult situation. Suddenly, Kaiden reached out and touched her face and placed his other hand on her bare shoulder. Coming closer to her, he suddenly said that he had seen her face somewhere before. Their eyes met, and Kaiden, carefully studying the girl's face, confirmed that he had definitely seen her before. Suddenly realizing that he was leaning on the girl with his whole body, he stood up abruptly and pulled her along with him. The guy started smiling and asked the girl to understand him correctly, but she quickly covered her face with her hands. He said that anyone would find it suspicious to meet an aristocrat in such a remote place. And the girl recalled that after the experiments in the temple, the guy without his earring could not control mana. However, in the original, this earring that held back the mana broke as soon as they got to the island. Because of this, Kaiden's ana cannot circulate normally. Sometimes he suddenly gets a fever. But sometimes something else happens. He completely loses control over his emotions and becomes a different person. And of course, the only person who can calm him down is the main character, Yuana. The girl just needs to hug the guy tightly, and he immediately calms down and his consciousness returns. Kaiden asked why Margaret was running away from him, and this question brought the girl back from her memories. The guy asked if she could talk, but immediately added that she had just screamed. Margaret remained silent, wondering if he would go mad as Enoch had recently done. But Kaiden didn't lose hope of getting the girl to talk, and playfully pretended that he hadn't heard what she said. Gathering her courage, the girl asked what he wanted, cowering inside with fear. Suddenly, he grabbed the girl by the hand and said that she was beautiful, frightening the girl even more. Margaret asked him to let her go, but the guy replied that he didn't want to, because since they had met, it would be nice to become friends. Suddenly, he said that no matter how much he looked at her, it seemed to him more and more that she looked like someone. He immediately shouted that he remembered why the girl jerked, but she was unable to escape from the guy's grip. And pointing his finger at the girl, he asked if she was that crazy lady Flown from the Langrid Empire. The words that she was crazy touched the girl, and she looked angrily at the guy. Margaret was angry, but Kaiden seemed not to notice, and taking a strand of the girl's hair, said that she seemed to have the same hair color. At this point, her nerves gave out, and the girl shouted that doesn't he know that being rude to a fragile lady is impolite? Kaiden froze, looking at Margaret, who, in turn, watched the guy carefully and tried to calm down. She speculated that he had come to the Floan estate to demand that funding for the experiment be stopped. But that was quite a long time ago, and besides, they only saw each other for a brief moment. Therefore, the girl really hoped that now Kaiden would hardly remember Margaret's face very well. She decided to change the subject and asked who he was, and the guy introduced himself as Kaiden Blake Rojade. He leaned towards the girl and ingratiatingly asked if she now understood who he was. But Margaret decided to pretend that she didn't know who he was, and shook her head. Still not believing it, Aiden asked again if she really wasn't Lady Floan, and the girl replied that it wasn't her. The guy smiled and said that it was good because he couldn't stand this woman, and there was an aura of death around him. Margaret tensed at these words, and she thought that the guy was making her blood run cold. Knowing a lot about threats, the girl thought that this was not at all how Enoch had threatened her. After all, Kaiden really is the very person who must kill her, and this is no longer just a threat. Suddenly, the guy started looking around and sniffing, as if he was looking for something. Then he turned to Margaret and seemed to sniff again, as if he had found something. Kaiden suddenly grabbed the girl by the shoulders and pulled her towards him with force, causing her to freeze in fear. The guy leaned towards the girl's neck, and she, gathering her courage, screamed at him about what was happening and what he was allowing himself to do. Kaiden almost touched her neck with his lips and quietly whispered that a sweet scent emanated from her body. Margaret was already starting to panic, and a scream was almost on her lips, when suddenly she calmed down and mentally forbade herself to scream. She realized that now was the perfect time to escape while Kaiden was distracted and kicked him in the leg with all her might. The guy's eyes widened in surprise, because he certainly didn't expect such decisive actions from the lady. A cry of pain echoed throughout the forest and seemed to rise to the sky, but only our heroes heard it. The guy dropped to one knee and grabbed his bruised leg, and the girl immediately ran away. Looking after Margaret as she ran away, the guy shouted at her to stop, but she seemed not to hear him and ran away. As she ran away, the girl thought that even if Kaiden wasn't going to kill her right now, it would happen sooner or later. Suddenly, Margaret saw a cliff ahead, but there was no turning back, so she continued running forward. Margaret grabbed the vine tightly and flew to the other side of the cliff, with Kaiden reaching out his hand after her. As she flew over the cliff, she thought that she didn't want to tremble with fear that she might die at his hands. The girl landed easily on the other side of the cliff and let go of the liana to run further. Kaiden watched her from the other side in surprise, and she thought that she couldn't be near such a person. The prince was enough for her. And Margaret ran forward under the admiring gaze of the guy, who certainly did not expect such agility from the lady. And after her, he shouted a question that would remain unanswered. Was she really a fragile aristocrat? The girl ran forward until she was completely exhausted and leaned against a tree, trying to catch her breath. She was still scared and really hoped that he definitely wouldn't be able to run here. Suddenly, she noticed something in her hands and began to look in surprise at the beautiful brooch in her hands. She was so scared that she just took it with her and thought that maybe he was chasing her because of this brooch. Looking around, Margaret noticed that the sun was already setting, painting the sky in red tones, and was surprised that it was already so late. This means that the time of monster activity is coming soon, and moving now will not only be reckless, but dangerous. Besides, she ran in a completely different direction from their shelter so that Kaiden would not find her. Margaret remembered the prince, who was left all alone in their shelter and even wounded. But she immediately pushed these thoughts aside and decided that now it was more important to worry about herself and not about Enoch. Looking around, she noticed a small crevice and decided that this was just the right place. She decided to hide below and wait out the night here, and when she blossomed, she would go back to the prince. Suddenly, she bumped into something with her foot and, looking inside, thought in surprise that this couldn't be. Margaret was holding the same first aid kit that Juana held in the original novel. The girl hugged her tightly and was happy, saying that she was now saved. She decided to open the medicine cabinet and check what medications she had and in what quantities. It contained iodine as well as Tylenol and medicine for colds, fever, and headaches. Margaret suggested that the merger with Margaret had made her read text more slowly. Fortunately, this knowledge was enough to save His Highness. The Duchess heard a loud noise nearby and thought it might be some monsters. She crawled deeper into the cave and hid, lying on the ground, waiting to meet the enemy. Looking out and hearing the sounds become louder, she decided that the monster was already nearby. She begged the gods that they would not notice her but simply pass by. Margaret listened and clearly heard that these were not animals, but steps similar to human ones. This monster was larger and walked on 2 legs like a humanoid. From his gait, it was clear that he was searching for some object. Margaret raised herself slightly to get a better look at the monster. She was shocked and covered her mouth with her hand, looking at the huge legs covered in fur. It was a huge monster, similar to a man, but covered in fur and large in size. The girl listened to his steps and began to think that he was looking for something and walking in circles. Suddenly, the monster knelt down in front of the crevice in the rocks where Margaret was hiding and was about to lift the stone. The girl understood that if he continued, he would definitely notice her, and that meant only one thing: death. She immediately remembered Enoch and thought that this would not have happened if he were nearby. Suddenly, somewhere in the depths of the forest, a scream or a howl was heard, and the monster froze, listening. Hearing the sound again, he stood up and wandered into the depths of the forest from where the scream came, forgetting about trying to lift the stone. Margaret lay for a while, holding her hand over her mouth and listening, afraid that the monster was actually lurking and waiting for her. That night she could barely contain her sobs, afraid that the monsters might appear again. And at some point she caught herself thinking that for the first time she desperately wanted to see Enoch. Soon the night gave way to a sunny day, and all fears about monsters could be put aside. Having emerged from her hiding place, the girl wandered into the cave. She looked tired because she had hardly slept. She wondered who it was, because he didn't look like the usual monster that lived here. The book mentioned that monsters could change and evolve, but there were no such strange creatures. The girl wandered along, thinking about what was happening in reality and trying to compare it with the plot of the book. She remembered the wolf monster and thought that his body was clearly beginning to change too. Suddenly, Margaret realized that the level of difficulty of survival here was becoming more and more hardcore. Finally reaching the cave, she wondered if she could even survive here. But the girl put all these thoughts aside, deciding to first take care of the prince's treatment. Entering the cave, she called His Majesty and asked how long he had been waiting for her. However, looking around, Margaret did not find the prince, and in front of her was an empty cave with a bed and leaves in the middle. After making sure that the guy was not there, the first aid kit fell out of her hands and all the medicines spilled across the floor. She couldn't even imagine that Enoch could leave, and her heart suddenly felt painful and hurt. The girl thought that he might have met the main character while she was away, and if that was the case, then he would leave our Margaret without regret. Since the prince was not here, there was no need for her to be here either, and she decided to look for an underground bunker, as planned. Suddenly, Margaret heard some noise behind her and turned around sharply. A breathless prince stood at the entrance. He called out to Margaret, as if he didn't believe that it was really her, and he reached out his hand to the girl. The girl turned around, looking at the prince, but he stood motionless, as if he was afraid that she might dissolve. The silence became awkward, and the girl broke it by saying that she thought he had left. Enoch didn't look well, but the girl still said that he looked fine, which meant everything was okay. Suddenly, the prince's gaze changed, and Margaret tried to understand why he was looking so angrily again. Looking at the prince burning with anger, the girl wondered if something had happened while she was gone. It suddenly occurred to her that perhaps he thought Margaret had run away. Before the prince could begin his angry tirade, she interrupted him and asked him to wait with his questions. Margaret reminded Enoch that she had told him she would go gather medicinal herbs. Pointing to the medicine cabinet, she said she had found something even better than just herbs. She clarified that it was a first aid kit, and that finding it was a stroke of luck, using slang from her home world. It suddenly dawned on her that she had used a word whose meaning Enoch didn't exactly know, and she looked at him with fear. The prince began to slowly approach her, and the girl said that the wound needed to be treated first to prevent infection. But her hurried story was interrupted mid-sentence when Enoch grabbed her hand. But it wasn't that he was angry, but that he noticed a bruise on the girl's face. He leaned down and pressed his forehead to Margaret's, quietly asking her never to do that again. Enoch promised to try not to get hurt again and asked not to do such dangerous things as searching for herbs anymore. The girl sat in shock, not understanding why he had suddenly changed his attitude so drastically. After all, it was those very sudden actions of the male hero that caused panic in everyone. Through the prince's eyes, it all looked like this. He woke up at sunset, in an empty cave. Standing up, he began to look around, trying to remember what he was doing here. Suddenly, he felt pain in his arm and, looking at it, saw a piece of dress that was wrapped around the wound. After thinking for a moment, the prince realized that it was a piece of Margaret's dress. He was surprised that the noble aristocrat even knew how to treat wounds and treat them. Suddenly, he thought that it was somehow quiet in the cave and began to look around in search of the girl. Enoch recalled the girl's words about medicinal herbs and realized that she had probably gone for them. Looking at the setting sun, the prince thought that although they had only been on the island for a short time, he had already managed to understand something. He noticed that several patterns were occurring on this island. The monsters did not show themselves during the day, but as soon as it got dark, they attacked him and Margaret. The prince realized that it was mortally dangerous to be outside in the evening and rushed off to look for the girl. He felt the burning gaze of the monsters hiding in the bushes, but he ran forward. And on the way, he reflected that if he were in a normal situation, he would never risk his life for Lady Floan. The wounds he had received earlier weakened the prince, and he stopped to catch his breath. Margaret helped him without hesitation in everything, and the prince wondered if he could survive without her. Suddenly, he remembered the words he had told her almost before leaving, about her not getting her hopes up. He also recalled the pain in his eyes as he added that it would be a burden for everyone. He suddenly grabbed his head, wondering why he had behaved so unworthily. The prince hit the tree, thinking that he had only pushed her away with barbed words when the girl had no one to lean on. He thought that Margaret must have been scared too, waking up in an unfamiliar place without support. That night, Enoch prayed desperately, hoping that the girl would survive and that she was now safe. And so, after a whole night of fears that he would never meet the lady again, he sat next to her and hugged her. He approached her, and out of embarrassment she asked what His Highness was doing. Suddenly he said his name and asked to be called Enoch from now on. Margaret looked at him and didn't understand why he was asking her in particular. The whole situation embarrassed the Duchess, and she thought the prince was rather strange. Margaret reflected on how people can change under extreme conditions. Enoch looked closely at his companion and noticed something unusual. He saw that the Duchess was wounded and politely asked who had done this to her. Taking her hand back, Margaret said that it was fine and not worth paying attention to. This whole situation puzzled the girl, and it was very unexpected for her. She thought the prince had a fever, which is why he might be acting strangely. The Duchess bowed her head in panic and took a deep breath to calm herself. She sat up and rested her head on her hand, exhaling and reporting that it was quite burdensome. Then she smiled sweetly and asked the prince not to pay attention to her. Hearing this, the prince began to look at the floor, remembering that these were his words. Margaret decided to ignore this fact and not turn a blind eye out of pity. She decided to change the subject and informed His Highness that she was damn hungry. The prince invited the Duchess to get ready and go hunting with him. She gladly agreed, but asked that his wounds be treated first. The prince was surprised, looking at his companion, and thanked her with all his heart. Having opened a jar of iodine, the Duchess decided to disinfect the wound. She started applying medicine to the wound and warned that it would sting. Margaret finished her work, sighed, and began wiping the sweat from her forehead. His Highness looked at the treated hand and highly praised his companion's work. The Duchess carefully put everything in the medicine cabinet and allowed them to go hunting. The prince looked into the medicine cabinet and asked the Duchess how she knew it was disinfectant. She looked at the jar and couldn't read what was written on it at all. Looking at the prince, she could not think of any way to explain this to him. She asked if the prince knew the continent beyond the sea and said that the language was from there. Margaret said that she had studied the language a little, and the prince believed her words. Fortunately for Margaret, the prince accepted this fact quite easily and calmed down. Margaret looked at the medicine cabinet and thought for a moment about one fact. She tried to understand why the author created a Korean survival kit. The prince once again reminded the Duchess of the wounds on her face and asked if she would like to share. He looked at the Duchess and waited for her to give him a detailed answer to his question. Margaret assumed he was asking because he knew the answer to the question. She thought that perhaps she shouldn't hide her meeting with Kaiden from the prince. Enoch will have to come face to face with this character sooner or later. While bandaging her sore leg, she said she had met a strange man. The Duchess said that a locket fell from him and scratched her cheek. The prince, listening to this story, did not immediately understand how this could have happened at all. The Duchess, despite the prince, finished bandaging and was already tightening the knot. The prince, splitting the stone with his bare hands, asked if she really didn't know the name of this man. Margaret ignored the question and told the prince that she had something for him. She said that it fell, hitting me on the cheek, and she picked up this artifact. As expected, the prince immediately recognized what artifact the Duchess had shown him. Margaret asked if the prince had fits at the sight of human blood. She realized that the question was tactless, but it was necessary for her continued survival. The prince grabbed his head and began to explain that it was possible to control the seizures. The symptoms returned after returning from the battlefield, but now that I'm on the island, it's difficult to control. He looked away, lost in thought, and the Duchess noticed something. She remembered several facts when she treated the prince for his wounds on his arm. The Duchess replayed this period in her head and tried to remember all the details. One of the facts shocked Margaret for a moment, and her eyes widened. The prince also remembered something, and they began to exchange glances. He became embarrassed and said that his fits ended when Margaret asked them to. The girl froze at these words and covered her mouth with her hand, expecting the prince to laugh and say that it was a joke. But it was clear from the guy's face that this was no joke, and Margaret wondered if he was serious. The prince began to talk about his childhood when he fiercely competed with his brothers. And I also remembered my youth, when in the heat of a fierce battle I lost comrades on the battlefield. In his entire life there was no one who would tell him this simple, but such an important word: stop. The prince fell silent and looked straight into Margaret's eyes, saying that perhaps these were exactly the words he needed. The girl listened intently to the guy, trying to understand where he was leading the story. Enoch said that this is the aftermath of the war. The memories of the battle are so strong that the sight of blood makes him lose control. Suddenly, the boy took a branch and cut his palm, causing several drops of blood to immediately flow from the wound. The girl rushed from the spot, shouting at the guy to stop, fearing the consequences. But Enoch stopped her, saying that light wounds were nothing and that he looked calm. Margaret sighed, seeing that the guy had not changed and had retained his sanity. Looking at him, the girl thought that no one had treated the consequences of the injury, and there was no one to help or console. Enoch said that if there was a control word that could stop an attack, it was probably the words she said. The girl was shocked and thought that she had apparently inadvertently brought to light something she shouldn't have known. In the original, Yuana solved this problem through physical intimacy, but this was not a real solution to the problem. Of course, for our heroine, such a solution was not an option at all. And anyway, who would have thought that such an ideal man would want someone to control him? Margaret sighed and told the prince that it was very good that there was a control word. She added that if a situation arises where there might be blood, the prince must definitely avoid it. Suddenly he asked what medicine they put on wounds, and the girl showed the jar, saying that it was an ointment for wounds. The prince squeezed some ointment onto his finger, and the girl only watched him in surprise. Enoch sat down hesitantly next to Margaret, holding his finger with the ointment on it up. The girl watched him silently, but when he approached, she could not resist and asked what he wanted to do. He gently touched the girl's face, spreading the ointment, and said that this wound also needed to be treated. Looking at the prince's concentrated face, Margaret wondered what else this perfect man would do. Enoch asked what else the man had done, and the girl replied that she had already told him everything. She briefly said that she kicked him and ran away, and then got lost and hid until the morning. The prince said seriously that until they got off this island, she should not move alone. Margaret replied that she hadn't planned to, but she thought to herself that of course that was a lie. Since she met Kaiden, being near the prince is not an option at all. She was seriously thinking about the need to quickly find at least some clue about the location of the bunker. But apparently, the difficult journey took its toll, and the girl fell ill for several days. When Margaret felt a little better, she went to the seashore. She could not even imagine that she could have an upset stomach. and she decided in all seriousness that she had to drink only purified water, even though it took a long time. First, she placed the container with water from the stream higher up and the empty one lower down, securing it to the ground. Then the folded long cloth was thrown between two coconut bowls of different heights. Over time, impurities from the water will settle to the bottom of the upper container, and moisture will flow down the fabric into the lower bowl under the influence of gravity. And if you boil this collected water over a fire, you will get clean drinking water. The girl was glad that the petticoat was made of cotton, but she felt a little sorry for this beautiful dress. As the water drained, Margaret reflected that she had not expected Enoch to take such good care of her while she was ill. She allowed the thought that he had begun to trust her, but if there was an immutable rule in the book, she would try to stay with him. But suddenly one thought interrupted all other thoughts and dreams about what could have been. She wondered if Enoch would change when he met the protagonist, despite all their torment. This development of events upset Margaret, but she decided that she had to take this idea into account. In the end, she firmly decided that she needed to find the location of the bunker before that moment. Suddenly, Enoch appeared behind her with the caught fish and asked why she wasn't resting. Margaret smiled sheepishly and said that they needed something to eat and drink, but the prince was not satisfied with the answer. He suggested going back to the shelter because, as the girl had said, they needed to eat a hearty meal first. Our heroes went to the cave, but suddenly something caught Enoch's attention. The guy stopped abruptly when he saw something ahead, and the girl walking behind him crashed into him. Rubbing her bruised head, she asked what happened, but the guy did not answer and only blocked the girl's path. The prince's attention was drawn to Kaiden, who was lying unconscious on the ground. Seeing why Enoch had stopped her, the girl turned pale with horror, and this did not escape the prince's attention. He immediately realized that it was the same man who attacked Margaret, and he angrily clenched his fists, calling him a bastard. The Duchess, suddenly seeing the stalemate of the situation, decisively blocked the prince's passage and gently asked him to wait a little. The prince was genuinely surprised by Margaret's unexpected behavior and quietly addressed her by name. She slowly dropped to one knee to carefully and cautiously examine the one lying motionless on the ground. Turning the unconscious guy onto his back, she finally and with horror became convinced that it was indeed Kaiden lying in front of her. The prince sternly asked if this was the same man who had once hurt her, and the Duchess silently confirmed it. She had previously been sure that she had broken away from him forever, but apparently he had been wandering around and had accidentally found their secret camp. The prince looked menacingly and coldly at this unpleasant picture and immediately offered to tie up the stranger for everyone's safety. He calmly said that reasonable caution would never hurt here, and this guy could very well be extremely dangerous. The Duchess looked around anxiously and hastily said that this had to be done urgently before sunset. Margaret suddenly began to faint. The prince deftly caught her and asked with concern how she was feeling now. She exhaled and said that everything seemed to be fine with her, and honestly shared that he had simply really scared her back then. She glanced again at the rapidly darkening surroundings and insistently asked to quickly transfer him to their camp. Suddenly, the Duchess was grabbed firmly and sharply by the arm and was again frightened by this unexpected action. The prince, placing his firm hand on the Duchess's back, kindly asked her to just wait here a little while. He carefully grabbed her thin hands and began to examine them closely, trying to figure out if everything was now in order there. The Duchess sheepishly thanked the prince for his touching concern, but sadly noted that there were still noticeable marks left. She felt deeply embarrassed after the prince took her hands and began to so obviously show genuine concern for her. He gently took her other hand and slowly, almost timidly, turned his companion to face him. Looking her straight in the eyes, he quietly and seriously asked whether he should now kill the one who had caused her this long-standing pain. The Duchess suddenly pulled away from the prince, folded her hands in front of her, and commanded him to stop immediately. She sincerely did not understand how one could simply kill a person just for an old mark on her delicate wrist. Margaret strictly ordered him to cast aside these dark thoughts and learn to control himself as best and quickly as possible. The prince silently folded his strong hands behind his back and began to hold them tightly, which seriously frightened his young companion. He, seeing her fear, suddenly laughed and with relief told the Duchess that he had already realized everything and began to quickly calm her down. The prince suddenly became very sweet and obediently promised to obey his faithful companion in everything from now on. He looked at the lying guy again carefully and appraisingly and confidently said that he was a great and dangerous magician. The prince reluctantly continued to tell about him briefly, but in the end he still offered to transfer him to their temporary camp. He didn't like this decision at all, but he wisely admitted that his rare magic could be quite useful later. He once again reluctantly offered to take him with him, but first of all he wanted to tie him up securely and tightly. The girl was inwardly very surprised that the prince was now asking her opinion and began to trust her more than usual. He gritted his teeth in frustration and said harshly that if she did not agree now, he would immediately just leave him here alone. The Duchess gently asked him not to worry so much, as she completely agreed with his sound opinion. She closed her eyes in mild pleasure, straightened her tired arms to crack her fingers well and loudly. Margaret was suddenly horrified to see the mage with severe, oozing wounds on his bare stomach. His light shirt was soaked in blood, and it was completely unclear where he had received such terrible wounds. She logically assumed that the recent rumble in the forest was created precisely because of the fall of the great mage Kaiden. The Duchess decided to deal with this later and imperiously ordered the prince to turn away and not look at the fresh blood. He was clearly already out of his mind, and in a strangled voice asked his companion to also urgently tie him up as quickly and tightly as possible. The girl menacingly and decisively placed her graceful leg on his powerful shoulder and demanded that he quickly stop this hysteria. The prince bit his lips until they bled and held back furiously as he listened to Duchess Margaret's insistent request. The girl finally realized that this strange method really works without fail, as the prince himself had told her earlier. With his monstrous physical strength, he could have easily pushed her away and stopped obeying her orders long ago. With a large sweat on his temple, he hoarsely demanded that she remove her leg, but the Duchess stood firm in her decision. He continued to order her angrily and demanded that she do it immediately, right now. The Duchess finally removed her foot, and the prince immediately fell to the ground completely unconscious from the wild strain. While tying up Enoch, she was incredibly glad that this difficult situation had nevertheless remained without any serious incidents. She thought about it and, clutching her head, tried with difficulty to understand how these two would have survived here without her. The Duchess waved her hand, realizing that these questions would not help her in any way now, and decided to immediately start making a fire. The prince began to twitch slightly and was gradually coming to his senses after recently passing out. The Duchess looked sympathetically at the regretful prince and asked affectionately how he was feeling now. She leaned down closer to him and carefully began to untie the prince from the rough bonds that bound him. The Duchess took him gently by his large hands and began to slowly and carefully untie the barbed rope. She asked with concern about the condition of his deep wound, and the prince only muttered that he was incredibly ashamed of what was happening. Kaiden's wound had also been carefully treated, and now, after applying the healing ointment, everything should heal quickly. The prince slowly ran his warm fingers over Margaret's face and quietly asked how her own wounds were. He continued to gently stroke her face and insistently clarified that he was not referring to the mage's wounds. Margaret smiled involuntarily and, slightly lost in thought, looked deeply into His Highness's eyes. Coming to her senses abruptly, she stepped back from him and cheerfully said that she and her wounds were completely fine. The prince gloomily warned that if she suddenly wanted to get rid of this guy completely, she should just say one word. Gritting his teeth and clenching his fists until they cracked, he coldly stated that it would not be that difficult for him to accomplish. The Duchess seriously doubted that it would be that easy, and besides, there was once again a huge risk of losing control over him. She clearly noticed something sharp and angry in his words and was anxiously worried that he still had not calmed down properly. It was all too difficult to comprehend, and the Duchess found it difficult to keep it all in her overloaded head. She was terrified that Kaiden would soon go crazy, like in the novel, but she selflessly treated his wounds throughout the long night. The Duchess also feared that the creature that attacked His Highness might well be deadly poisonous. Kaiden lay there all this time, pale, with a wet compress on his hot forehead, and only occasionally moaned weakly. Having finally made sure that he was gradually getting better, both heroes decided to immediately inspect the immediate surroundings of the cave. The Duchess followed slowly and wearily after the prince, who was now armed with some kind of homemade wooden spear. It was physically difficult for her to explore the surroundings because of the tropical heat, which was simply unbearable here. The Duchess vaguely remembered that both the bunker and the hut were located somewhere near the very foot of a huge mountain. That same hut, from memory, was located near the steepest cliff in a particularly inaccessible place. The last time she had climbed with Enoch, 3 of these large, dark mountains had been clearly visible in the distance. First, they decided to explore the already familiar mountain, and then methodically 2 other unfamiliar ones. Margaret had a vague idea that the intense heat was making everything around her seem suspiciously yellow and blurry. She closed her tired eyes and helplessly put her hand to her hot head in the faint hope that it would soon get better. Margaret suddenly tripped over a root, but the prince deftly managed to catch her and prevented her from falling rudely. The prince pressed her tightly to his chest and sternly asked her to be more careful in the future and watch her steps carefully. Margaret saw the fresh marks of his wounds up close and couldn't help but look at them closely. Suddenly realizing what she was doing at the moment, she abruptly pushed the prince away from her and was very frightened by her own impudence. Enoch was genuinely surprised by this and worriedly asked his companion if everything was suddenly okay with her. She became deeply embarrassed and muttered that everything was fine, but it was just too stuffy and hot in here. The prince instantly heard her words as a silent plea for help and immediately, carefully took her into his strong arms. The Duchess did not expect such a rapid turn of events and was very surprised by the unexpectedness. The prince was sincerely worried that if they continued to walk so slowly, his fragile companion would soon faint. He encouraged them by saying that it was only a short distance to the stream where they could cool off and take a rest. The prince stood firm in this decision, even if the whole situation was extremely awkward and embarrassing for Margaret herself. Against the picturesque backdrop of a green forest, a large waterfall with icy drinking water roared and foamed. Margaret cooled down in the cold water with childish delight, and the exhausting heat slowly and pleasantly left her body. The prince gallantly said that he would stand guard nearby for now, and she could safely call him to her whenever she wanted. He turned his proud head towards her and began to talk about possible help, when suddenly he fell silent awkwardly and became very embarrassed. He couldn't help but notice how she gracefully adjusted her wet hair and her beautiful, open, tanned shoulders. Completely embarrassed, he suddenly fell silent and blushed noticeably, and the Duchess began to ask curiously what he wanted to say. He quickly turned away and, embarrassed, through clenched teeth, repeated what he had already told her before, without looking. The prince was mentally angry with himself for his weakness, and, clenching his teeth, furiously ordered himself to pull himself together immediately. The Duchess suddenly interrupted his agonizing internal dialogue by unexpectedly grabbing him by the wet sleeve of his shirt. The prince did not immediately realize this gesture, as he furiously scolded himself for his shamelessness, but he finally came to his senses in time. The Duchess turned her back to him and sheepishly asked him to help her unfasten her dress because her hands couldn't reach the clasp. The prince was extremely puzzled by this intimate request, and he asked her even more embarrassedly to repeat her strange request. The Duchess sighed and said that she too felt awkward asking this, but she urgently needed help unzipping this tricky zipper. She had only one dress on the island, and if it got wet now, there would be absolutely nothing to change into. The prince was very embarrassed and internally resisted a vague desire, stealthily looking at her naked back. The Duchess insisted on his help, as she herself could not cope with this annoying mechanical task. Gathering his mental strength, the prince finally managed to overcome himself, and with a trembling hand, he unzipped the capricious zipper on his dress. He turned thoughtfully to Margaret and asked what she most dreamed of doing when she finally returned from this island. The Duchess immediately thought out loud about taking a good wash with foam and tasting some exquisite forgotten dishes. Margaret nostalgically recalled how magnificent and luxurious her last dinner had been in a distant civilization. That dinner was once eaten by the old Margaret, not the current heroine, but now all her vivid memories have become her own memories. The current heroine wasn't so much concerned with how tasty the local primitive food might be. She now really missed her noisy hometown, where she was born and grew up so carefree. Margaret then asked the prince what he himself would do immediately after returning back to the castle. He thought deeply, lowering his dark eyes, and honestly told his companion that he simply did not know the answer yet. The Duchess was not at all satisfied with this evasive answer, since she herself answered her own question with the utmost sincerity. She jokingly wanted to hit him lightly in anger, but he quickly managed to grab her small, graceful hand. He quietly explained that if he told the whole truth now, she would soon feel very awkward and ashamed from what she heard. The prince gently poked his index finger along the bare, damp back of his blonde companion, pointing out the obvious. He said with a grin that he had already unbuttoned her dress a long time ago, and she was still just standing there motionless and stupid. She shuddered, recoiled from him in fear, and asked reproachfully why he hadn't told her about this important fact earlier. The Duchess looked at him in amazement, and could not understand when he had managed to become so unexpectedly impudent and uninhibited. The prince immediately apologized, but she mentally noted that this behavior was not at all like the previous character from the book. He suddenly ran somewhere deep into the forest and begged his companion not to turn around and look at him now. The Duchess finally began to calmly undress in order to take a proper bath, and she kept wondering why the prince was acting so strangely today. She swam with serene pleasure in the cool, clear water, lazily lying on her back and looking at the sky. It was incredibly pleasant to simply lie in the warm sun, listening to the lulling sound of the river, and gently cool down in the sweltering heat. The Duchess had finally swum to her heart's content and began to reluctantly leave the water because it was urgent to finish her exploration. She came out of the water onto the shore, but her neat dress had disappeared without a trace, and now she could not put on anything at all. Margaret panicked and asked Enoch where her dress could be, but he only replied in confusion that he honestly didn't know. He sincerely did not understand why she was asking him when she herself had just recently laid him on these large stones. The companion was deeply puzzled and anxiously told the prince that she felt as if her dress had magically disappeared. The prince was completely shocked by what he heard and did not understand how such a thing could have happened here before their eyes. He already reflexively wanted to turn around and talk to the Duchess, but she stopped him in time with a frightened cry. She definitely didn't hear anyone else approaching, but the obvious disappearance of the item meant that they were clearly not alone here. The prince wondered darkly whether there was some evil meaning in this kidnapping, and who could really have done this vile thing. Armed with a heavy stick, he decided to silently examine all the bushes around and asked his companion to wait patiently here. He carefully and silently made his way through the dense forest, tensely hoping to hear something suspicious or see a shadow. Margaret was left alone in the cold water and was horrified at what the hell was going on there lately. The prince suddenly saw in the distance how some unknown man in a green military uniform was quickly carrying the dress into the depths of the dark forest. He caught up with the scoundrel with lightning speed, roughly dropped him face down into the damp earth, and began to menacingly threaten him with the sharp end of his spear. The prince, turning coldly to the lying man, said mockingly that there were too many familiar faces on this damned island. The boy turned with difficulty to look at the prince, and incredibly, it turned out to be that very same Sir Diego. Having recognized the prince, he begged His Highness to stop, although he was quite determined. The boy asked what was going on here, to which Enoch replied that he should be asking that question. Looking into the boy's eyes, the prince asked how the commander of the Imperial Guard ended up on this island. He replied that he suddenly lost consciousness during training, and when he woke up, he was already lying on the riverbank. Hearing the answer, the man lowered his spear, and Diego breathed a sigh of relief, continuing to clutch the dress in his hands. He immediately showed his respect and, dropping to one knee, thanked His Highness. The commander asked how the prince ended up here on this island. He replied that the same thing happened to him. He was busy with business in the palace, and when he woke up, he found himself here. The prince asked if he had managed to find out anything or request help, and Diego replied that he had not found out anything and that it was impossible to request help from here. Suddenly, the guy said that he had 2 more companions with him and the same thing happened to them. His companions, Crown Prince Asdal and Archbishop Rousef, woke up on the island in the same situation. The prince thought it was too strange a coincidence that only key figures from the 2 empires were here. At first he thought it was another of Rodvan's intrigues, targeting the prince, but judging by those gathered here, that was not the case. Suddenly, Enoch's attention turned to the dress, and he asked if any of his companions needed women's clothing. Diego said that one of his companions needed clothes, but Enoch replied that it was clearly not for a prince or an archbishop. The boy looked at the prince with fear and asked if he really suspected him. Enoch's face showed anger and irritation. The question clearly angered him. Suddenly, the prince raised his spear again and aimed it straight at the frightened boy's face. Without a second's hesitation, he ordered him to answer the question, "Who is the dress for?" Diego shouted that he was a knight of the Langrid Empire. He was not an enemy of the bird. Enoch replied that since he was not an enemy, why didn't he come up with that excuse before stealing his companion's dress? There was no more room for denial, so Diego said that among his companions was Joanna Lucy. The prince was a little surprised and asked again if they were really talking about that same great saint. A saint who appeared in the Empire a century ago, possessing unique divine powers. The prince was surprised that even the church ministers could not avoid the disaster, which meant that there really were no gods. The prince asked Diego why the woman had no clothes and that he had decided to steal them. Sitting down next to the guy, the prince said that this dress was his companion's only clothing. And since he stole it, the saint had to remain naked for it to be any kind of justification. Judging by the boy's silence, Enoch concluded that the saint was dressed. He extended his hand and ordered the dress to be returned immediately, causing the boy to shudder in fear. He handed the folded dress to the prince without hesitation, apologizing for his actions. Enoch said that in 10 days they should meet again, and if they moved far, he should give a sign. And he added that all this should happen in such a way that his companions would not know. Looking at the prince's back, Diego asked in surprise if the prince would really not go with him. Enoch turned around, glaring at the boy, and reminding him that he had ordered him to only answer questions. Diego immediately saluted, closing his eyes, realizing that arguing with the prince was useless. Enoch reminded him that if he found out a way to escape, he should report it and not let his companions see him. And at the end, he added that if he angered the prince, he might not expect mercy. Diego understood that these were not just words, but a threat that could easily become reality, and he obediently bowed his head. All this time, Margaret sat on a stone, wrapped in a thin petticoat. The girl was shivering from the cold after the cool water in the river, and read that she was cold to death. She cowered, wondering where Enoch had gone and who the pervert was who had stolen the dress. But she found it difficult to concentrate, and the cold made her sneeze. The worst thing was to get sick, and if this continued, she would definitely catch a cold. Suddenly she heard Enoch's voice and turned around joyfully, looking at the hurrying prince. The guy apologized for being late and asked if everything was okay with her. The girl jumped to her feet joyfully and exclaimed in surprise that he was able to find the dress. Suddenly her head began to spin, and before she realized it, Margaret began to fall. She plopped into the water, and the prince, throwing back her dress, rushed after her into the river. Lying on the water, our heroine was sad that this body had the stamina of a dead fish. When Margaret opened her eyes again, she was already in a different place and was trying to figure out where she was. Suddenly, she heard the prince's voice and was surprised to realize that she was lying on the boy's lap. Margaret jumped up in confusion and gasped, asking what had happened and how they had gotten back to the cave. The prince suddenly apologized, and our heroine asked in surprise what he was asking for forgiveness for. He replied that the girl's temperature suddenly rose. It looked like a cold. But while going through the medicine cabinet, he didn't know what medicine he could give her and felt guilty. Enoch added sheepishly that he had never felt so helpless before. Margaret immediately tried to calm the prince, saying that it was not his fault. She added that the loss of the dress had also caused a stir and looked at herself in surprise. The girl asked where he found it, but the prince was in no hurry to answer. Enoch reluctantly replied that the fact was that he had met Sir Diego then. The girl was surprised because the commander of the Imperial Guard is a walking image of nobility and knightly honor. How could he steal clothes? Margaret grew angry, wondering where his chivalrous spirit had gone. Suddenly the prince bowed and said that since this was his subordinate, he asked forgiveness for the outrages. The girl asked him how he could apologize, and the prince replied that he knew that she was afraid of Sir Diego. He is a straightforward person and especially did not tolerate her when she pestered the prince and also often behaved aggressively. Enoch added that it was for this very reason that he hid the fact that the dress belonged to her. And if she wants to get a personal apology from Diego, then he will drag him here. The girl was surprised by such behavior and replied that she would take revenge on him later. Enoch, as if expecting exactly this answer, smiled with relief. Suddenly he extended his hand and, saying that he knew it, stroked the girl's head. The girl's first reaction was irritation. Did he really take her for a puppy? But she soon realized that such touches did not cause discomfort. It was strange for Margaret, but for some reason her soul felt calmer, probably because no one had ever done this before. Suddenly she asked. There was no one else except Sir Diego, and the prince tensed up a little. He looked away and said he didn't know, and Margaret asked if it wouldn't be better to work together in their situation. Enoch replied that Diego was in the same situation and he also knew nothing. He added that they agreed to meet every 10 days and share information. These words of Enoch calmed the girl a little, and she thoughtfully said that everything was logical. Suddenly, Margaret remembered something and, looking herself over, looked up at the prince. She said that she was wearing just a shirt, but then she found herself wearing a dress, and the guy quickly turned away. After clearing his throat, the prince said that he had dressed her himself, trying not to look, and asked her not to worry. Margaret asked if he had really seen everything, and the guy didn't know what to answer her. The girl immediately began to lament that it was all over, and now no one would marry her. Enoch replied that if it bothered her so much, she could marry him and the problem would be solved. Margaret recalled that when she proposed marriage, he categorically refused, and that's what happened now. The guy said that then and now everything has changed, both the circumstances and her. Looking into the prince's eyes, the girl thought that she was still Margaret, and Margaret was her. But looking back on everything that happened, it doesn't matter anymore. The girl decided to change the subject and asked how Kaiden was feeling. The prince replied that he had a fever last night, but was fine now. Margaret replied that her fever had also gone down, so she would sleep somewhere else. The prince reached for the girl, but then immediately removed his hand and wished her good night. The round moon rose over the island, dispelling the darkness, and the girl slept peacefully. But something interrupted her peaceful sleep, and she suddenly felt that she was in a very difficult situation. And when she opened her eyes, she saw Kaiden's face in front of her. The guy covered her mouth with one hand and held her hands tightly with the other. At first, Margaret didn't understand whether it was a dream or reality, and when she finally woke up, she tried to scream. But the guy pressed his palm forcefully to her lips and asked her not to scream so as not to wake the prince. He suddenly smiled predatorily and asked why she had deceived him by saying that she was not Margaret. Kaiden suggested that it might be because he said he couldn't stand Lady Floan. He praised the girl because if he had found out then that she was Margaret, who knows what he would have done. It would be very suspicious that he would meet her first on the island. The guy also said that it was very strange the girl's face was the same as before. But for some reason it seemed to him that she was a completely different person, completely to his taste. The next second, the guy received a blow to the ribs and flew away from the girl. He sat up and grinned angrily when he heard the prince say that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. Enoch stood between Kaiden and Margaret, shielding her with his body. He was angry and said that how could it be that he had just woken up, but immediately began to threaten his savior. The prince did not calm down, asking whether it was really possible to behave like this in any country. Kaiden didn't believe it at first, and asked again if Margaret had really healed his wounds. The prince asked the girl if she allowed him to address her so familiarly, to which the guy replied that when life hangs by a thread, does etiquette matter? The prince replied that it really didn't matter now, but when they got out, everything would be different. Kaiden said he never expected to live to see the day when Crown Prince Enoch would stand up for Lady Floan. But Margaret wasn't worried about etiquette and names and asked Enoch to wait. She boldly approached Kaiden, who was sitting by the wall, which greatly surprised the guy. Margaret asked where he got these wounds from. It was important for her to understand who exactly inflicted them. Kaiden said that the island was actually infested with monsters, and one of them had attacked him. And with a friendly smile, he added that he was glad that at least she was okay. The girl immediately realized that the noise that night that distracted the monster was from Kaiden. Looking at the guy, she thought that despite the hatred, he sacrificed himself, knowing that she was in danger. Margaret held out her hand, holding the thing she had taken with her that night. She asked Kaiden if it was his, and the guy looked at her with obvious reluctance. He reached for the thing and said that it was actually an important thing, but he didn't really like it. Kaiden said that this is an amulet from the magic tower, where the magic of the rulers is contained. The girl said that he was carrying a strange thing with him and asked if it was some kind of tradition or symbol. The guy replied that when the tower's lord dies, his magic is sealed in this pendant. Kaiden told about the pendant, that even before the founding of the empire, the magic of one of the rulers was sealed in it, and that the power was capable of wiping out an entire country. Only the magician who created the pendant can remove the seal from the pendant, but it is useless. He finished the story by saying that the man had died 1,000 years ago, and the girl wondered why he had told all this. Kaiden changed the subject, asking the prince and the girl how they ended up on the island. The prince, without answering, asked the boy how he ended up there, and he carelessly replied that he had stormed the temple. And looking at their gloomy faces, I decided that they weren't going to explain anything. Kaiden wasn't too upset and added that as soon as his wound healed, he would leave. And smiling, he winked and thanked Margaret for the treatment. The girl didn't answer and asked where he was going to go. Looking at the guy, she wondered if he might know where the bunker, hut, or door was. But Kaiden replied that he would simply go somewhere on the island, showing that he had no plan. He said that he wanted to search the entire island, since he had no memories of the transfer, then perhaps it was a teleport, which meant there had to be a portal. Our heroes were surprised, and Enoch said that he hadn't even thought about such a possibility. Kaiden said he was quite experienced in this matter, which was to be expected from a mage. Suddenly, the guy looked into Margaret's eyes, clearly about to say something to her personally, and the next moment he extended his hand and asked if she would come with him. Enoch gritted his teeth in anger, and Margaret did not immediately grasp the meaning of the magician's words. Kaiden clearly expected exactly this reaction and just winked at her. The prince, hearing the magician's invitation, stood between them, making his position clear. Enoch became angry to the point of gnashing his teeth and rudely asked him what he was doing. He continued to cover for Margaret and sought answers to his questions from the magician. The prince took the Duchess by the hand and told her that they were going to bed. Margaret didn't resist, but looked thoughtfully at the magician as she left. She didn't want to go with Kaiden, and a reason to politely refuse him presented itself. The magician watched the blonde leave and was already planning something in his head. He asked if she was going to leave, and if she was, why she was doing it. The Duchess looked at the smiling magician very suspiciously. She said that food was gradually running out, and that it was difficult to get in such conditions. Margaret remembered that he had promised to leave after the wound had healed, but he was still here. Enoch, a few days earlier, seeing that the wound had healed, put him out on the street. He kept a close eye on the magician to make sure he didn't do anything nasty. Kaiden was no slouch either and watched closely what the prince was doing. He was very stubborn and spent 2 nights in a row near the entrance to the cave. The Duchess took some water with her and went about her business, calling the magician crazy. He asked where the Duchess was going, and she replied that she was going on a reconnaissance mission in the mountains. Margaret started to leave, but the magician threw himself at her feet, asking her not to abandon him. She waved her hand at him and said that the patient should rest peacefully. Much time passed, and the sun began to slowly set behind the horizon. The Duchess was exhausted and fell to her knees, cursing everything she could, but could not find the bunker. Leaning against a tree, she decided that she urgently needed to rest. Margaret opened her bamboo flask and began to drink the water with great pleasure. Having quenched her thirst to her heart's content, she exhaled and immediately felt better. The Duchess was tormented by the thought that if she did not find a bunker or a hut, she would have to leave here. They had been on the island for 3 weeks now, and there had been no search results yet. Enoch communicated with Diego regularly, but this also did not produce any results. Margaret found herself thinking that she had already gotten used to the island and hadn't noticed it. Enoch was overprotective of his companion, but allowed her to walk until sunset. The sun was already quite low, and it was time for the Duchess to descend. She hoped that she would be lucky and find some clue connected to the island. As she descended, the Duchess stepped on something unusually purple in color. It was a flare pistol, and the inscription on the handle could be read. Near the trigger there was the inscription, Alea. The Duchess was interested in what it meant. She tried to remember if there was such a weapon in the original. There was also a bag of cartridges. Taking it in her hands and pointing it to the side, she wondered if it even worked. Holding it horizontally, she began clicking it randomly, but nothing happened. Looking at it, she thought that it was broken and would not work properly. Margaret raised her hand and pulled the trigger again, hoping it would work. Holding the bag in her hand, she was frightened by the gunshot, her eyes wide. The sky lit up with orange light. The Duchess was shocked by what was happening. Clutching the bag of ammunition, she heard the red wolves howling in the forest. The Duchess was very frightened and, cursing everything, began to run away to the camp. She saw that the sun was beginning to set and began to run even faster. All this seemed like complete madness to her. She didn't understand how this could be. While running away, the Duchess came across a log which she easily jumped over. She grazed it with the edge of her heel, cutting it in half and sending the halves flying. The log flew back and crushed the red wolves that were attacking the Duchess. The girl did not stop and while running noticed something unusual on the way. She saw a man in white clothes with long hair standing near the camp. She screamed loudly and ordered him to get out of the way and hurry. The man did not understand what she demanded of him and looked at her with a face of complete calm. Suddenly he realized what was happening and his face twisted in horror. He saw enraged, terrible wolves running after the Duchess. She shouted at him not to stand there like a pillar, but to run away from these evil, toothy monsters. As she ran past him, she grabbed his hand and pulled him along with her. The red wolves continued to pursue the pair and had no intention of falling behind. The boy assumed that the creatures had gathered because of the magic he had seen in the sky. The Duchess reported that, firstly, magic did not work on the island. She said that what he saw was not magic, but something completely different. Margaret was worried that at this pace the monsters would definitely catch up with them and eat them. She saw a rock in the distance that could help them escape the red wolves. The Duchess came up with a plan and asked the boy to press himself to the ground at the signal. She aimed her pistol at her companion and told him to lie down. Seeing that her companion had lain down with his hands covering his head, she began to aim. The shot was followed by a fiery explosion, which most likely hit the monsters. The Duchess sat down and began breathing rapidly, trying to catch her breath. The man approached Margaret and began loudly asking who she was. The Duchess assessed the man's appearance and assumed that he was from the retinue of the papal curia. He asked if she was a witch, without ever thanking the girl for saving his life. Margaret demanded gratitude from him or offered to become food. The man was frightened and shocked by such an approach to his person. He thanked her for saving him and suddenly saw something unusual in her. Taking Margaret by the shoulders, he began to ask if her name was Lady Floan. He was dissatisfied and asked why she was following him even on this island. The man asked if the Duchess was pursuing him for a love potion. Margaret began to remember the terrible things she had done in the book. How she bribed priests, gave bribes, and blackmailed people. The Duchess felt ashamed and told the man that her name was different. He ordered her not to lie and to admit that she was the one to blame for his kidnapping. The Duchess did not like his tone, and especially the accusations of her involvement in the kidnapping. She knew that if she gave in to his words, she would be left completely without allies. Margaret thought about the situation and decided to use her method. She accused him of being rude and, pointing her finger, reminded him that she had saved him. The guy was shocked and said that it was not appropriate for a lady to behave like that and shout. She latched onto the word lady and continued to insist on saving him. Margaret made him bow and thank him, returning the favor 100-fold. The man was shocked by what was happening and could not utter a single word. The Duchess continued waving her finger and making him apologize. The guy bowed and began to stand in that position without saying anything. Margaret was infuriated by this situation, and she, looking at him menacingly, forced him to apologize. The man was shocked but bowed, thanked her, and immediately apologized to the girl. The Duchess looked at this situation and, while he was standing there, decided to run away quickly. The guy stood in place and watched in surprise as the Duchess ran away from him. She hoped that they would never see each other again and ran away as quickly as possible. The sun was setting and the sky was already quite scarlet. It was necessary to get to the camp as early as possible. Margaret finally broke away from everyone and stopped near her camp. She stood and tried to catch her breath, to collect everything that had happened to her in one place. The Duchess knew the plan was doomed, as she had clashed with the protagonist from the very beginning. Margaret tried to understand why that guy was wandering around here all alone. Enoch stood near the cave with a spear in his hands and worried about his companion. The Duchess turned around and looked at the prince with a stupid expression on her face. Enoch greeted her with his shirt unbuttoned and seemed very glad to see her. She looked at him, thinking that he would swear, and looked for an excuse. The prince silently embraced the Duchess, as if he thought he would never see her again. He did all this silently, which confused Margaret, who did not understand anything. His Highness the Prince continued to embrace her, oblivious to his surroundings. Margaret began to swear at the prince, saying that she was suffocating and needed oxygen. He told the blue-eyed girl that he saw a large red magic circle in the sky. The prince was worried that something bad might happen to her and could not find a place for himself. Margaret understood this, being in his strong and warm embrace. She burst into tears and asked the prince for forgiveness for making him worry. Margaret also hugged the prince and wanted to tell him a lot about what was happening, that the strange circle was the trace of a signal flare that attracted the monsters. She wanted to tell about the man she saved on the way back to the cave. She cried, pressing her lips together, and held the prince tightly by his white shirt. His Highness wanted to take care of his companion and treated her legs. The antiseptic stung the wounds, and the Duchess said it hurt. The prince apologized to her and said that it just happened that way, which surprised the Duchess. She asked where Kaiden was, and the prince said that he had gone off to look for himself. Margaret said that this was very bad and extremely life-threatening. Enoch looked at her with empty eyes and did not want to understand what she was telling him. She started telling how she had been hiking in the mountains and had completely lost track of time. Margaret said that because of the flash in the sky, red wolves were chasing her. The Duchess continued to complain and tell all this in small details. The prince, hearing all this, exhaled deeply and, tired, began to roll his eyes. He grabbed his head, which he had lowered, and said that he was very angry with himself. The prince was worried and thought about what had happened and felt guilty. He said he had to create conditions where she would be completely safe. The Duchess did not agree with his words and claimed that she was to blame. She told the prince that he was wrong and should not be held responsible for her at all. The Duchess suggested that it was an expression of chivalry in extreme circumstances. She was worried and, due to nerves, tore her long dress a little. Margaret assumed that he would have to report upon arrival at the castle, but he asked her not to worry. The prince thought about Margaret's words and did not agree with her reasoning. Pointing her finger, she told him not to think of her as someone who needed saving. The Duchess continued to hold her finger and ordered him to take care of himself. She told the prince that without her he would not last a day on this damned island. Margaret didn't understand why he agreed so quickly, although she was deliberately exaggerating. His Highness shrugged and said that it was an irrefutable fact. Margaret thought she was in control of his attacks, but she was worried about the appearance of the main character. It bothered her a lot, and she tried to remember how it was in the book she was reading. The prince met his companion's eyes and said that he was not indifferent to her either.